The wind howled through the Montana mountains like the breath of something ancient and unforgiving. On the edge of Ridgewood, where civilization gave way to wilderness, stood Blackthorn Ranch, a place the locals whispered about but never visited. For 40 years it had sat empty, its fields choked with weeds, its buildings sagging under the weight of secrets. When Thomas Brennan received the deed to this cursed land, he had nothing left to lose. Broke, divorced, and hollow, he arrived expecting only a place to disappear. But in the ruins of that forgotten ranch, he found a dying mare with eyes that seemed to hold impossible knowledge. What she would show him, hidden beneath decades of fear and superstition, would unravel a mystery older than the mountains themselves and give a broken man one final chance at redemption. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The envelope had arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, delivered to the cramped studio apartment where Thomas Brennan had been living since the divorce papers were finalized. The return address meant nothing to him at first, just the name of a law firm in some Montana town he had never heard of. He had torn it open with hands still calloused from years of construction work, hands that had been idle for 3 months since the company laid him off. Inside was a letter written in formal legal language that took him several readings to understand. His uncle Silas, a man he had met exactly twice in his entire life, had died. The old man had left him something in his will. Thomas sat at his kitchen table that evening, the letter spread flat before him, a cup of instant coffee growing cold at his elbow. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the muffled argument of neighbors through the thin walls. He read the words again, trying to find the catch, the hidden clause that would reveal this as some kind of mistake. Blackthorn Ranch, 200 acres in Flathead Valley, Montana. The property included a house, a barn, fencing, and all structures thereon. It was his, free and clear, with no liens or encumbrances. At the bottom of the letter, written in a shaky hand that must have belonged to his uncle in the final days, was a single line that the lawyer had included as a postscript. The land remembers what we choose to forget. Thomas had no idea what that meant. He had no memory of Uncle Silas beyond 2 childhood visits, both uncomfortable and marked by his father's tight silence. The Brennan family did not talk about Silas. He was the brother who had gone west, the one who chose solitude over family, and his name was spoken only in passing, if at all. Now that strange old man had left Thomas a ranch, and Thomas had nowhere else to go. The drive from Minneapolis to Montana took 3 days. Thomas packed everything he owned into the back of his pickup truck, a battered Ford with a cracked windshield and an engine that rattled when pushed past 60. He drove through the autumn landscape, watching the fields turn to prairie, the prairie give way to foothills, and finally the mountains rising like the bones of the earth itself. The air grew thinner and colder. The towns became smaller, separated by longer stretches of empty highway. By the time he crossed into Montana, the sky had turned the color of slate, and the first flurries of snow were dancing across the road. Ridgewood appeared just as the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting everything in shades of gray and deepening blue. It was the kind of town that existed because it had always existed, clinging to the landscape through sheer stubbornness. Main Street stretched for 4 blocks, lined with buildings that looked like they had been standing since before the wars. The Timber Lodge diner glowed with warm light, and Thomas could see figures moving inside, but he did not stop. The directions from the lawyer led him north out of town, along a dirt road that climbed into the hills. Blackthorn Ranch sat at the end of that road, nestled in a valley where the mountains pressed close on 3 sides. The gate was open, hanging crooked on rusted hinges, and the wooden sign that once bore the ranch name was cracked and faded to illegibility. Thomas drove slowly up the long driveway, his headlights cutting through the gathering dark. The house loomed ahead, a 2-story structure with a sagging porch and windows that stared like empty eyes. Beyond it, he could see the outline of the barn, its roof caved in on one side, and further still, the shapes of fence posts marching away into shadow. He stopped the truck in front of the house and killed the engine. Silence rushed in immediately, profound and complete. No traffic noise, no voices, not even the sound of wind. just stillness so deep it felt like pressure against his ears. Thomas sat for a moment, hands still gripping the steering wheel, staring at the dark house. He had expected to feel something, relief perhaps, or hope, or at least curiosity. Instead, he felt only a cold knot of dread settling in his stomach. The air outside the truck was sharp with the smell of pine and the promise of snow. Thomas pulled his jacket tighter and walked toward the house, his boots crunching on gravel that was half buried in dead weeds. The porch steps groaned under his weight, and the front door opened with a shriek of hinges that shattered the silence. Inside, the house smelled of dust and decay, the particular staleness of a place that had been sealed away from life for too long. He fumbled for a light switch and was surprised when it clicked on, revealing a front room filled with furniture draped in white sheets, everything coated in a thick layer of dust that his footsteps disturbed into swirling clouds. Thomas spent that first night on a musty couch, too exhausted to care about comfort, listening to the house settle and creak around him. He did not sleep well. His dreams were fragmented and strange, filled with the sensation of being watched, of voices just beyond the range of hearing. When he woke before dawn, his body ached and his mouth tasted like copper. Through the window, he could see the first pale light touching the tops of the mountains, and closer, the dark silhouette of the barn against the growing brightness. It was on his way to the barn that morning that Thomas first saw the mare. He had been walking the property, trying to get a sense of what he had inherited, cataloging the repairs that would need to be done if he intended to make anything of this place. The barn was in worse shape than he had thought, with whole sections of the roof missing and the smell of rot heavy in the air. He was standing just inside the entrance, looking up at the exposed beams, when he heard it. A soft sound, almost like breathing, coming from one of the back stalls. Thomas moved cautiously, picking his way through debris and old hay gone black with mold. The stalls were mostly empty, their gates hanging open or torn away entirely. But the last stall, the one furthest from the door, had its gate closed. He approached slowly, and as his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he saw her. The mare lay in the corner of the stall, her body pressed against the back wall as if trying to disappear into the wood itself. She was an Appaloosa, her coat a pattern of dark spots over a lighter base, though both were dulled by grime and neglect. Her ribs showed starkly beneath her skin, each breath a visible effort. Her legs were folded beneath her at an awkward angle, and her head rested on the filthy straw, too heavy to lift. But her eyes were open, and when Thomas leaned over the stall gate, those eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him catch his breath. For a long moment, neither moved. Thomas stared at the horse, his mind racing. How long had she been here? How had she survived? The water trough in the stall was dry, filmed with green algae. There was no food that he could see, only scraps of ancient hay so desiccated it crumbled to dust. Yet the mare was alive, watching him with eyes that seemed far too aware, far too knowing for an animal that should have. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Been dead weeks ago. Thomas opened the stall gate, the hinges screaming in protest, and stepped inside. The mare flinched but did not try to rise. He knelt in the straw beside her, close enough now to see the extent of her condition. Her coat was matted and crusted with dirt. There were sores on her flanks where she had been lying too long in one position. Her hooves were overgrown and cracked. But it was her eyes that held him, dark and liquid and filled with something he could not name. Not fear exactly, though there was an element of that. Something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, or plea or warning. He reached out slowly, his hand hovering in the air between them. The mare's nostrils flared, her ears swiveling toward him. Then, with a trembling effort, she lifted her head just enough to touch her muzzle to his outstretched palm. The contact was electric, a jolt that ran up his arm and lodged somewhere in his chest. Her breath was hot against his skin, her nose velvet soft beneath the grime. Thomas felt something crack inside him, some wall he had built during the long months of loss and failure. His throat tightened, and he had to blink hard against the sudden burning in his eyes. "Who left you here?" he whispered, his voice rough and unused. The mare exhaled, a sound that was almost a sigh, and lowered her head back to the straw. Thomas sat back on his heels, his mind working through the practical problems. She needed water immediately, food, veterinary care. He had maybe $300 in his checking account, the last remnant of his final paycheck. It would have to be enough. He spent the next hour hauling water from the pump he found behind the house, filling buckets and carrying them to the stall. The mare drank slowly at first, tentative, as if she had forgotten what water tasted like. Then she drank deeply, her throat working, her eyes half closing. Thomas found a bag of grain in his truck, left over from a construction site where they had been feeding the strays, and he softened some in warm water before offering it to her. She ate with the same cautious hunger, taking small amounts, pausing, then eating more. By the time the sun was fully up, Thomas was exhausted and filthy, his clothes soaked with spilled water and his hands black with dirt. But the mare was still alive, still breathing, and that felt like something. He sat on an overturned bucket outside her stall, watching her through the gap in the gate. She had not tried to stand, but her eyes were brighter now, more alert. She watched him back, and he had the unsettling feeling that she was measuring him, judging whether he could be trusted. The sound of an engine broke the morning quiet. Thomas stood, his body protesting, and walked to the barn entrance. A truck was coming up the driveway, newer and cleaner than his, painted a dark green. Stopped near the house and a woman climbed out. She was older, maybe late 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face weathered by years of outdoor work. She wore jeans and a heavy canvas jacket, and she moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. "You must be Thomas Brennan," she called out as he approached. Her voice was clear and direct, cutting through the cold air. "Grace Holloway. I own the ranch to the west. Heard you were coming." Thomas nodded, suddenly aware of how he must look, covered in grime and exhaustion. "News travels fast," he said. Grace smiled, though it did not reach her eyes. "Small town. We notice when someone new arrives, especially when they inherit Blackthorn." She glanced past him toward the barn, her expression growing serious. "You know about the place, then? The history?" Thomas shook his head. "I know my uncle lived here. That's about it." Grace was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving across the property, taking in the broken fences and overgrown fields. "Silas kept to himself," she said finally. 40 years he lived here, and I doubt he spoke more than 10 words to anyone in town. Before him, this ranch had a different name and different owners. Family called Ashford. They farmed it for a generation. Then one winter they just vanished. House abandoned, animals left to starve. People searched, but they never found a trace. After that, the land sat empty for years. Silas bought it cheap, moved in, and folks figured that was the end of it. But strange things kept happening. Crops would fail for no reason. Animals would sicken and die. Workers he hired wouldn't stay more than a few days. They said the place was cursed, and Silas did nothing to convince them otherwise. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "And my uncle? What happened to him?" Grace met his eyes, and her expression was sympathetic but firm. "They found him in the house about 2 months ago. Natural causes, the doctor said. Old age. But he looked like he had been frightened by something before he died. Eyes wide open, mouth twisted." She paused. "I'm not trying to scare you off. I'm just saying you should know what you've taken on." Thomas glanced back at the barn, thinking of the mare lying in the dark stall. "I found a horse," he said, "in the barn. She's in bad shape." Grace's eyebrows rose. "A horse?" "Silas didn't keep animals. Said they wouldn't survive here. Well, she's there. And she's alive. Barely." Grace walked with him back to the barn, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. When they reached the stall and she looked over the gate, her face went pale. "That's impossible," she said softly. "What is?" Grace pointed at the mare. "That's one of the Ashford horses. Or her bloodline, anyway. Appaloosas with that specific pattern. The family bred them. When they disappeared, the animals were sold off or died. There shouldn't be any left. Not here." Thomas stared at the horse, a cold weight, settling in his chest. She couldn't have been here for 40 years. No, Grace agreed. But she's here now. And if the stories are true, nothing stays on this land unless it has a reason. Part 2. The first days Grace left shortly after, promising to send Dr. Philip Garrett, the veterinarian who served the scattered ranches in the valley. She pressed a piece of paper into Thomas's hand with her phone number scrawled across it in pencil, telling him to call if he needed anything, though her tone suggested she did not expect the offer to be taken up. Thomas watched her truck disappear down the driveway, the sound of the engine fading until only the wind remained, stirring the bare branches of cottonwoods that lined the creek. He returned to the barn, to the stall where the mare lay watching him with those impossibly alert eyes. The morning light filtered through gaps in the roof, casting bars of gold across the dirty straw. Thomas pulled the bucket closer and sat down, his back against the rough wood of the stall wall. He had no plan, no idea what he was doing here. The ranch was a ruin. He had no money to fix it, no knowledge of how to run such a place even if he could afford the repairs. The sensible thing would be to sell it, take whatever money he could get, and return to the city to start over. But as he sat there watching the mare struggle for each breath, he knew he would not do that, could not do that. The horse shifted slightly, her legs trembling with the effort, and Thomas moved closer. He placed his hand on her neck, feeling the heat of her skin through the matted coat, the flutter of her pulse beneath his fingers. She was burning with fever, her body fighting something he could not see. He had worked with animals before, summers spent on his grandfather's farm in Wisconsin when he was young, but that had been cattle and pigs, sturdy creatures bred for hardiness. This mare was something different, delicate and fierce at once, hanging on to life with a determination that seemed almost supernatural. "You're tougher than you look," Thomas said quietly. The mare's ear swiveled toward his voice, and for a moment he thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, some spark of acknowledgement. He knew it was foolish to read human emotion into an animal's gaze, but he could not shake the feeling that she understood, that she was listening not just to his words but to something deeper. The day stretched long as Thomas worked to make the barn more habitable. He cleared debris from the aisle, swept out the other stalls, and patched the worst holes in the roof with scraps of plywood he found stacked against the back wall. The physical labor felt good after months of idleness, his muscles remembering the rhythm of work, and by afternoon he had managed to create a space that felt less like a tomb and more like a shelter. He brought more water for the mare, sitting beside her as she drank, stroking her neck with slow, gentle movements. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly, and Thomas felt that strange crack in his chest widen a little more. Dr. Philip Garrett arrived just before sunset, his truck rattling up the driveway with a trailer bouncing behind it. He was a man in his 60s, lean and weathered, with silver hair and hands that moved with the practiced certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime working with animals. He climbed out of the truck carrying a battered leather bag and surveyed the ranch with a critical eye before turning to Thomas. "Grace called me," Garrett said without preamble. "Said you found a horse in bad shape." His voice was flat, skeptical, the tone of someone who had seen too much suffering to be easily moved. Thomas led him to the barn, to the stall where the mare lay. Garrett stepped inside without hesitation, setting his bag down and crouching beside the horse with the ease of long practice. His hands moved over her body, checking her pulse, listening to her breathing, examining her eyes and gums. He worked in silence, his expression unreadable, and Thomas stood at the stall gate watching, his stomach tight with anxiety. Finally, Garrett sat back on his heels and looked up at Thomas. "How long has she been like this?" "I don't know," Thomas admitted. "I found her yesterday morning. She was here when I arrived." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "Grace told me about the Ashford connection. You know that's impossible, right? This horse can't be more than 10 years old, maybe 12 at the outside. The Ashfords disappeared 40 years ago." Thomas shrugged helplessly. "I'm just telling you what I found." Garrett turned back to the mare, his jaw working as if chewing over a problem. "She's severely malnourished," he said after a moment. "Dehydrated, feverish. Her hooves are a mess, probably painful to stand on. But that's not what's killing her. He paused, his hand resting on the mare's shoulder. There's something else. Something I can't diagnose. It's like she's being poisoned, but I can't find a source. Her blood is all wrong, her organs are stressed, but there's no physical cause that I can see. Thomas felt ice slide down his spine. What does that mean? Garrett stood, wiping his hands on his jeans. It means I can give her fluids, antibiotics, something for the fever. I can trim her hooves and treat the sores. But if whatever is making her sick continues, she's not going to make it. He met Thomas's eyes, his expression grave. This land has a reputation, son. Animals don't thrive here. They sicken and die, always have. If you're planning to save her, you're fighting more than just neglect. Thomas swallowed hard. I have to try. Garrett studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, I'll do what I can. But I'm warning you now, it might not be enough. The veterinarian worked for the next hour, administering injections, setting up in 4-line that would drip fluids slowly into the mare's system, cleaning and bandaging her sores. He showed Thomas how to mix the medications, how to monitor her temperature, how to recognize the signs if she began to decline. When he was finished, he packed his bag and stood, looking down at the horse with an expression that might have been pity or might have been resignation. I'll come back in 3 days, Garrett said. If she's still alive, we'll reassess. He paused at the stall gate, turning back. What are you going to call her? Thomas had not thought about it. He looked at the mare, at the pattern of spots across her coat that seemed to shift in the dim light, dark against lighter, like embers cooling in ash. The name came to him without conscious thought, rising from some place deep in his mind. Ember, he said. Garrett nodded. Good name. Let's hope she lives long enough to answer to it. After the veterinarian left, Thomas sat alone in the barn as darkness gathered outside. He had strung a work light from one of the beams, and it cast harsh shadows across the stall. Ember lay quietly, her breathing steadier now with the fluids running into her vein, but she was still desperately fragile. Thomas pulled a blanket from his truck and spread it over her body, tucking it gently around her legs. She did not stir, but her eye opened, tracking him as he moved. He made himself a crude bed in the next stall, piling old hay and covering it with a sleeping bag he had brought from the city. It was not comfortable, but it was close enough that he could hear if Ember's condition changed in the night. He lay in the darkness, listening to the creak and groan of the barn, the whisper of wind through the broken roof, and the soft, labored breathing of the mare. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by dreams that felt more like memories, images of people he did not recognize walking through fields that glowed with an unnatural light. He woke before dawn to find Ember watching him. Her head was lifted slightly off the straw, her ears pricked forward. Thomas scrambled to his feet, his body aching from the hard ground, and moved to her stall. She did not flinch as he approached, and when he knelt beside her, she stretched her neck out and pressed her muzzle against his chest. The gesture was deliberate, unmistakable, and Thomas felt tears sting his eyes for reasons he could not name. You're still here, he whispered, his voice breaking. Good girl. You're still here. He spent that day establishing a routine. He checked Ember's 4-line, gave her medication according to the schedule Garrett had written out, and brought her small amounts of softened grain mixed with supplements. She ate slowly, cautiously, but she ate. He changed the soiled straw in her stall, replacing it with clean bedding he found stored in the loft, ancient bales that crumbled in his hands but still smelled faintly of summer grass. He talked to her while he worked, a steady stream of words that filled the silence. He told her about his life, about the construction job he had lost, about the marriage that had crumbled under the weight of resentment and disappointment. He told her things he had never spoken aloud, secrets he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten them himself. Ember listened. He was certain of it. Her eyes followed him everywhere, and when he spoke, her ears swiveled toward his voice. There was intelligence in that gaze, a presence that went beyond mere animal awareness. It should have unnerved him, but instead, it brought comfort. For the first time in months, Thomas did not feel entirely alone. On the second day, Grace returned, her truck loaded with supplies. She brought bags of grain, bales of hay, a new halter, and a thick winter blanket for the horse. She also brought food for Thomas, a casserole wrapped in foil and still warm from her oven, a loaf of bread, and a thermos of coffee that tasted like salvation. "You look like hell," Grace said bluntly as she set the supplies on the tailgate of her truck. "When's the last time you slept in a real bed?" Thomas ran a hand through his hair, realizing with some embarrassment that he had not showered since arriving, had barely eaten anything beyond crackers and canned soup. "I'm staying in the barn," he said, "in case she needs me." Grace's expression softened. "You can't help her if you collapse." She glanced toward the barn, then back at him. "How is she?" "Alive. That's about all I can say." They walked to the barn together, and Grace stood at the stall gate, looking at Ember with an expression Thomas could not read. The mare lifted her head, studying the older woman with those knowing eyes. Grace was silent for a long time, then she shook her head slowly. "I've lived in this valley my whole life," she said quietly. "I've seen animals sicken on this land, watched crops wither for no reason. There's something wrong with Blackthorn, something that goes deeper than bad luck or poor soil. People say the Ashfords disturbed something, dug where they shouldn't have, and the land never forgave them." She turned to Thomas, her face serious. "If that horse is connected to this place, to whatever happened here, you need to be careful. Some things are better left buried." Thomas wanted to dismiss her words as superstition, as the kind of local folklore that grew around any place with a dark history. But standing in the barn with Ember's eyes on him, feeling the weight of the land pressing down from all sides, he found he could not. There was something here, something old and patient and watching. He felt it in the stillness of the air, in the way the shadows seemed to gather in corners, in the dreams that woke him gasping in the middle of the night. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. Grace met his gaze steadily. "I think you should do what you're already doing. Take care of her, but keep your eyes open. If she starts acting strange, if you see or hear anything unusual, don't ignore it. This place has a way of showing you things, and not all of them are pleasant." After Grace left, Thomas stood alone in the barn, the weight of her warning settling over him like a physical thing. He looked at Ember, at the way the afternoon light caught the reddish tones in her coat, making her look almost as if she were glowing from within. She met his gaze, and in that moment Thomas made a decision. Whatever secrets this place held, whatever darkness lurked beneath the surface, he would face it. Not for the ranch, not for his uncle's memory, but for the mare who had chosen, inexplicably, to trust him. That night, as he lay in his makeshift bed listening to Ember's breathing, Thomas heard something else. A sound like wind, but not wind, moving through the barn. It carried with it a whisper, words in a language he did not understand, rising and falling like a song. He sat up, his heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls. Ember stirred in her stall, her ears pricked forward, her body tense. She was listening too, and in her eyes, Thomas saw not fear but recognition, as if she knew what the sound meant, as if she had been waiting for it. The whisper faded slowly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Thomas lay back down, but sleep did not return. He stared at the darkness above him, his mind racing. Whatever Grace had warned him about, whatever secrets this land held, they were beginning to wake. And Ember somehow was the key. Part 3. The naming morning arrived with frost covering everything in white crystal, transforming the desolate ranch into something almost beautiful. Thomas woke stiff and cold, his breath misting in the air inside the barn. He pulled himself from the sleeping bag and immediately went to check on Ember. She was awake, her head turned toward him as if she had been waiting. The 4-bag hung nearly empty, and he replaced it with a fresh one, his fingers clumsy in the cold. The mare's condition had improved marginally. Her breathing was less labored, and when he offered her grain, she ate with more enthusiasm than the day before. Thomas allowed himself a small moment of hope, fragile as the ice forming on the water trough. He wrapped the blanket more securely around her and spent the next hour mucking out the stall, working until sweat dampened his shirt despite the freezing air. When he stepped outside, The sun was climbing over the eastern mountains, painting the snow-dusted peaks in shades of rose and gold. The beauty of it struck him unexpectedly, a reminder that the world contained more than just ruin and loss. He walked toward the house, intending to finally clean himself up, when movement near the tree line caught his eye. A figure stood at the edge of the pines, tall and still, watching the ranch. Thomas froze, his pulse quickening. The figure was too distant to make out clearly, just a dark shape against the trees, but there was something in its posture that felt wrong, as if it were not quite standing the way a person should stand. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Not walking away, not ducking behind cover. Simply gone, as if it had never been there at all. Thomas stood motionless for several minutes, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing more. The rational part of his mind insisted it had been a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the branches, but his gut told him otherwise. He had seen something or someone, and they had been watching him. Inside the house, Thomas forced himself through the motions of normalcy. He showered in water that ran rust-brown before clearing, standing under the weak stream until his skin burned and his muscles unlocked. He ate the casserole Grace had brought, cold and straight from the container, barely tasting it. The house felt wrong around him, the silence too complete, the air too still. Photographs lined the hallway leading to the bedrooms, faded images of people he did not recognize. He paused in front of one showing a family standing before the barn, a man and woman with 2 children, all of them smiling. The Ashfords, he assumed. They looked happy, prosperous, with no hint of the darkness that would consume them. In what must have been his Uncle Silas's bedroom, Thomas found journals stacked on a desk by the window. The leather covers were cracked with age, the pages yellowed and brittle. He opened one at random and found it filled with cramped handwriting, observations about the weather, notes on repairs needed around the property, and scattered thoughts that grew increasingly strange as the entries progressed. Thomas flipped to one of the later pages and read, "The land speaks at night, not in words but in feelings that press against the skull. It wants something, has wanted it for decades, maybe centuries. The Ashfords tried to give it what it demanded, but they failed. Or perhaps they succeeded too well. I hear them sometimes, in the walls, in the ground beneath my feet. Whispering. Always whispering." Thomas closed the journal, his hands trembling. His uncle had been losing his mind, that much was clear, driven to paranoia by isolation and age. Yet the words echoed uncomfortably with what Thomas himself had experienced the night before, with the whispers that had moved through the barn like wind. He gathered several of the journals and carried them back to the barn, unwilling to stay in the house any longer than necessary. Ember greeted him with a low nicker, the first sound he had heard her make. It was weak, more breath than voice, but it filled Thomas with irrational joy. He set the journals aside and sat with her, running his hands along her neck, feeling the bones beneath the skin. She was still painfully thin, her ribs a stark landscape beneath the blanket, but her eyes were clearer today, more focused. She watched him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable and comforted at the same time. "You know something, don't you?" Thomas said quietly. "About this place. About what happened here." He felt foolish talking to a horse as if she could understand complex ideas, but the conviction remained. Ember knew things he did not, had seen things he had not, and somehow, impossibly, she was trying to tell him. Dr. Garrett returned on the 3rd day as promised, his truck crunching up the driveway just after noon. He examined Ember with his usual thoroughness, checking her vitals, studying the foresight, palpating her abdomen. When he finished, he sat back and looked at Thomas with an expression of grudging approval. "She's improved," Garrett said. "Not by much, but she's holding her own. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." He paused, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "But I'm still seeing things in her blood work that don't make sense. It's like she's fighting off something constantly, some toxin or infection that I can't identify. If you can figure out what's causing it, she might have a real chance." Thomas told him about the whispers, about the figure at the tree line, about the journals he had found. Garrett listened without interruption, his expression neutral, but Thomas could see the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. When Thomas finished, the veterinarian was quiet for a long time. "I'm not a superstitious man," Garrett said finally. "I deal in science, in things I can measure and treat. But I've lived in this valley long enough to know there are things science can't explain. Blackthorn has a history, and that history left scars. If your uncle's journals mention the Ashfords trying to give the land something, you need to find out what that was. It might be connected to why this mare is sick, why animals die here." "How do I do that?" Thomas asked. Garrett stood, brushing straw from his jeans. "There's a woman in town, Margaret Weston. She runs the library, but more importantly, she's the unofficial historian of Ridgewood. If anyone knows what the Ashfords were doing before they vanished, it's her." He met Thomas's eyes. "Be careful. Some stories are buried for good reasons." After Garrett left, Thomas sat with the journals, reading through his uncle's increasingly frantic entries. Silas had been obsessed with the Ashford disappearance, had spent years trying to piece together what had happened. The journals were filled with fragments of research, references to local Native American legends, mentions of sacred sites and disturbed ground. One entry, dated just weeks before Silas's death, caught Thomas's attention. "Found the entrance today. Sealed it shut 40 years ago when I realized what it was, what they had done. Should have burned this place to the ground then. But I was a coward. Now it's too late. It knows I'm dying. It's getting ready to wake again." Thomas read the passage 3 times, his mind racing. Entrance to what? What had Silas sealed? And what was waking? He looked at Ember, who was watching him with those knowing eyes, and felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the cold. The next morning, Thomas drove into Ridgewood. The town looked different in daylight, less ominous and more simply worn. A collection of aging buildings clinging to existence through habit rather than prosperity. He parked in front of the library, a small brick structure that might have been a schoolhouse once, and went inside. The interior was warm and smelled of old paper and dust. Shelves lined the walls, packed with books that looked like they had not been moved in decades. Behind a desk near the window sat a woman with iron-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked up as Thomas entered, and something in her expression suggested she had been expecting him. "Thomas Brennan," she said. It was not a question. "I'm Margaret Weston. Grace called and said you might be coming by." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Sit down. We have things to discuss." Thomas sat, feeling oddly like a student called before a principal. Margaret studied him for a moment, her gaze assessing, then pulled a folder from her desk drawer and laid it between them. "The Ashford family," she began without preamble, "came to this valley in 1935. Robert and Catherine Ashford, along with their 2 children, purchased the land that would become Blackthorn Ranch. They were farmers, hardworking people by all accounts, and for the first few years they prospered. Their crops were abundant, their livestock healthy. They expanded their operation, built new structures, became pillars of the community. Then, in the winter of 1943, everything changed. She opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings yellow with age. Thomas saw headlines about a missing family, search efforts, investigations that led nowhere. Margaret continued, her voice steady and detached, as if reciting facts long memorized. Robert Ashford had become interested in the history of the land, particularly in Native American sites. The valley had been sacred to the Blackfoot people, used for ceremonies and burials. Robert began excavating on his property, digging in areas that local elders had warned him to leave alone. He found artifacts, pottery, tools, and something else. No one knows exactly what because he never showed anyone. But after that discovery, things started to go wrong. Animals died mysteriously. Workers reported feeling watched, hearing voices. Catherine Ashford told a neighbor she wanted to leave, that her husband had changed, become obsessed with something beneath the ground. Thomas felt ice forming in his stomach. What happened to them? Margaret met his eyes. They disappeared on February 14, 1944. All 4 of them. The house was found with food still on the table, a fire burning in the hearth. No signs of struggle, no indication of where they had gone. Searchers combed the property and the surrounding forest for weeks. They found nothing. Eventually, the case was closed as an unsolved missing persons situation, though many believed they had fled in the night and met with some accident in the wilderness. "And my uncle?" Thomas asked. "Did he know about this?" Margaret nodded slowly. Silas Brennan bought the property in 1945, knowing full well its history. He told people he didn't believe in curses, that he could make the land productive again. But within a year, he had stopped trying to farm it. He became reclusive, paranoid. On the rare occasions he came to town, he would mutter about keeping something sealed, about protecting the valley. Most people thought he had lost his mind. She paused, her expression grave. Maybe he had. Or maybe he knew something the rest of us refused to believe. Thomas pulled out one of his uncle's journals and showed her the entry about finding an entrance and sealing it. Margaret read it carefully, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I suspected as much," she said quietly. "There are stories, old stories from before white settlement, about a cave system beneath what is now Blackthorn Ranch. The Blackfoot considered it sacred, a place where the boundary between this world and the spirit world was thin. They performed ceremonies there, left offerings, and most importantly, they respected its power. When Robert Ashford began digging, many believe he broke through into those caves and disturbed something that should have remained undisturbed." "Do you believe that?" Thomas asked. Margaret closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. "I believe that Blackthorn Ranch has killed or driven away everyone who has tried to live there for nearly a century. I believe your uncle spent 40 years alone on that land, terrified of something he wouldn't name. And I believe that if you're planning to stay, you need to understand what you're dealing with." She fixed him with a hard stare. "That horse you found, the one that shouldn't exist, that's connected somehow. Animals are sensitive to things we can't perceive. If she's leading you somewhere, you need to decide whether you're brave enough to follow." Thomas left the library with more questions than answers, his mind churning with implications. He drove back to the ranch slowly, watching the landscape roll past, the mountains looming on all sides. When he arrived, he went straight to the barn, needing the simple comfort of Ember's presence. She was standing. The sight stopped him in his tracks. Ember stood in her stall, legs trembling but holding her weight, her head lifted and her ears pricked forward. She looked toward him as he approached, and for the first time since he had found her, she took a step forward. It was shaky, her hooves dragging slightly, but it was movement, progress, life asserting itself against all odds. Thomas felt tears blur his vision as he entered the stall. He wrapped his arms around her neck, pressing his face against her coarse mane, breathing in the smell of horse and hay and survival. Ember leaned into him, her body warm and solid, and he felt something in his chest that had been frozen for months begin to thaw. "You're going to make it," he whispered. "We both are." That night, Thomas sat in the barn with Silas's journals spread around him, reading by lantern light while Ember dozed in her stall. He was searching for any mention of where the entrance might be, any clue to what his uncle had sealed. Hours passed, his eyes growing heavy, when he found it. A sketch on the back page of one journal, crude but clear. It showed the layout of the barn, with an X marked in the corner of the last stall. Ember's stall. Thomas looked up slowly, his gaze moving to where the mare stood. She was awake, watching him, and in the lantern light, her eyes seemed to glow with their own internal fire. She knew. She had always known. That was why she had been in this stall, why she had survived when she should have died. She was guarding the entrance, or waiting beside it, or perhaps something else entirely. Thomas stood, his heart pounding, and walked to Ember's stall. He ran his hands along the back wall, feeling for seams, for anything unusual. The wood felt solid under his palms, ancient planks that had stood for generations. Then his fingers found it, a gap where two boards met, so narrow it was almost invisible. He pressed, and the wood gave slightly, creaking in protest. Ember moved to stand beside him, her shoulder pressing against his. She nickered softly, urgently, as if encouraging him. Thomas looked at her, seeing in her eyes both warning and invitation. Whatever lay behind this wall, whatever his uncle had sealed away, the Time for hiding was over. The land was waking, and Thomas would have to decide whether to face what rose with it or flee like everyone else before him. He pressed harder against the wood, and somewhere deep beneath the barn, something shifted in the darkness. Part 4. The ancient secret. Thomas spent the rest of that night prying at the wooden panels, working carefully to avoid damaging the structure. Ember remained close, her presence steadying him even as his hands shook with a mixture of anticipation and dread. By dawn, he had loosened 3 boards enough to reveal what lay behind them. A narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, descended into absolute darkness. Cold air flowed up from below, carrying with it a smell that was ancient and mineral, like stone that had never seen sunlight. He fashioned a torch from rags soaked in kerosene and tied it to a length of pipe. The flame guttered in the draft from below but held. Thomas looked at Ember one last time. The mare stamped her foot once, twice, a deliberate rhythm that felt like encouragement or perhaps warning. Then he lowered himself through the opening, his boots finding purchase on rough-hewn steps that descended steeply into the earth. The passage was narrow and claustrophobic, the walls pressing close on either side. Thomas had to turn sideways in places, his torch casting wild shadows that danced across stone carved by hands long turned to dust. The steps went down far deeper than he had expected, 50 feet or more, until finally they opened into a cavern that took his breath away. The space was vast, the ceiling lost in darkness above. The walls were covered in pictographs, images painted in red and white and black that depicted animals and human figures and symbols whose meaning had been lost to time. In the center of the cavern, a spring bubbled up from the rock, its water catching the torchlight and throwing rippling reflections across the painted walls. But the water was wrong. It ran dark, almost black, and where it pooled, nothing grew. The stone around it was stained and pitted, as if corroded by acid. Thomas moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. Near the spring, he found what Robert Ashford had discovered. A cairn of stones had been built beside the water, and atop it sat objects that gleamed dully in the torchlight. Pottery vessels, beaded jewelry, tools of copper and bone. Offerings left by people who had understood this place's power and had honored it accordingly. But the cairn had been disturbed, stones scattered, artifacts removed and discarded carelessly nearby. And in the center of the destruction, driven deep into the rock like a stake, was a metal rod. Thomas knelt beside it, examining the crude iron shaft. It had been driven through the spring source, piercing the stone from which the water emerged. Around its base, something black and oily seeped up, mixing with the water and poisoning it. This was the source of the curse, the thing that had killed the land above. Robert Ashford had found this sacred place and, in ignorance or arrogance, had tried to tap its power. Instead, he had ruptured something vital, releasing whatever had been kept in balance by the careful rituals of those who had come before. The implications crashed over Thomas like a wave. The poisoned water seeped up through the soil, tainting everything it touched. Animals that drank from Black Creek, crops that drew sustenance from the aquifer, all of it contaminated by whatever leaked from this violated spring. And Ember, somehow descended from the Ashford's horses, had been drawn back to this place, compelled by instincts older than understanding to guard the source of her bloodline's suffering. Thomas stood and gripped the iron rod. It was embedded deeply, and rust had fused it to the stone. He braced his feet and pulled, muscles straining, but it did not budge. He tried again, throwing all his weight into it, and felt it shift slightly. A grinding sound echoed through the cavern, and the dark water bubbled more violently. Thomas pulled harder, desperation lending him strength he did not know he possessed. With a shriek of tortured metal, the rod tore free. Thomas fell backward, the rod clattering across the stone floor. For a moment nothing happened. Then the spring convulsed. The black water churned and frothed, and from deep below came a sound like a great exhalation, as if the earth itself was breathing out poison it had held too long. The water began to clear, the oily darkness dissipating, replaced by liquid so pure it seemed to glow with its own light. Thomas watched in awe as the transformation spread. The corroded stone around the spring began to heal, cracks sealing, stains fading. The water overflowed its pool and ran across the cavern floor in channels that had been carved for this purpose centuries ago, flowing toward openings in the walls that led deeper into the earth. The air itself seemed to change, growing warmer, losing the oppressive weight that had pressed down since he had first descended. He climbed back up the passage, his heart pounding with exhilaration and residual fear. When he emerged into the barn, morning light was streaming through the gaps in the roof, and Ember stood in the center of her stall, transformed. Her coat gleamed with health, the dullness gone, replaced by a sheen that made the red tones in her coloring blaze like actual embers. Her eyes were clear and bright. All cloudiness vanished. She tossed her head and whinnied, a sound full of strength and joy. Thomas laughed, the sound strange to his own ears after so long. He wrapped his arms around her neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the skin, the steady thunder of her heartbeat. She nuzzled him gently, her warm breath against his cheek, and he knew with absolute certainty that she would live, that they both would. Over the following weeks, the change spread across Blackthorn Ranch. The grass began to grow again, pushing up through the frost in defiant green shoots. Black Creek ran clear for the first time in living memory, its water sweet and cold. Animals returned, deer grazing in the north pasture, birds nesting in the cottonwoods. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the land lifted like fog before the sun. Thomas worked from dawn until dusk, repairing fences and buildings with a vigor he had not felt in years. Grace came often, bringing supplies and company, and her presence filled spaces in his life he had not realized were empty. Dr. Garrett visited weekly, ostensibly to check on Ember but really to marvel at the transformation, both of the horse and the land. The veterinarian never asked what had happened, but Thomas saw understanding in his eyes, an acknowledgement that some mysteries were better left unspoken. Vincent Mercer appeared one afternoon, his expensive truck looking absurdly out of place on the rough driveway. He was a man in his 50s with silver hair and a suit that probably cost more than Thomas's truck. His smile was practiced and cold as he approached where Thomas was mending a gate. "Mr. Brennan," Mercer said smoothly, "I represent a development consortium interested in this valley. We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your property." He named a figure that would have solved every financial problem Thomas had. Thomas set down his hammer and looked at the land around him, at the fields greening with new growth, at Ember grazing peacefully in the pasture, at the mountains standing eternal against the sky. He thought about the spring flowing pure beneath the barn, about the balance that had been restored, about the responsibility that came with knowing what lay beneath this ground. "It's not for sale," Thomas said quietly. Mercer's smile tightened. "Be reasonable. You've been here, what, a month? You have no idea what you're turning down." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "I know exactly what I'm turning down, and I know exactly what I'd be giving up. This land isn't just property. It's a trust." Mercer's expression hardened, but he recognized finality when he heard it. He left without another word, his truck spitting gravel as it accelerated down the driveway. Thomas watched him go, feeling no regret, only a deep sense of rightness. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of fire, Thomas stood at the fence watching Ember run. She moved with fluid grace, her hooves barely seeming to touch the ground, and in the slanting light, she looked almost ethereal, as if she might dissolve into the golden air. She circled back to where he stood and thrust her head over the fence, demanding attention. Thomas obliged, scratching behind her ears while she closed her eyes in contentment. Sheriff Hutchins drove up as darkness gathered, his cruiser's headlights cutting through the dusk. He climbed out slowly, his expression serious. Thomas felt his stomach tighten, wondering what new trouble had found him. "Just wanted to check in," Hutchins said, leaning against his car. "There's been talk in town. People are noticing the changes here. Some are saying it's a miracle. Others are nervous, like maybe you've stirred up something that should have stayed quiet." Thomas considered his words carefully. The land was sick. Now it's healing. That's all. Hutchins studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. Just wanted you to know that whatever you did, it hasn't gone unnoticed. For what it's worth, I think you did right. This valley needs more healing and less fear." He pushed off from the car and tipped his hat. "You take care of yourself and that horse." After the sheriff left, Thomas returned to the barn. He had sealed the entrance to the cavern, replacing the boards and securing them firmly. The spring would flow as it was meant to, feeding the land from below, but its sanctity would be protected. He had considered telling Margaret about what he had found, but some knowledge was too dangerous to share. Let the stories remain stories. Let the mystery stay mysterious. Ember had taken to sleeping in the barn even though he had opened the pasture gate. Thomas understood. This place was her anchor, her purpose. She had waited here, growing sick along with the land, guarding the secret that would heal them both. Now she remained not as a sentinel but as a companion, choosing to stay close to the man who had chosen to stay with her. Thomas made his bed in the barn that night, no longer out of necessity but out of preference. The house still felt wrong to him, filled with the echoes of his uncle's paranoia. Out here, with Ember's steady breathing nearby and the clean smell of hay, he found peace. He lay in the darkness thinking about the path that had brought him here, about the losses that had stripped away everything he thought defined him. He had come to Montana expecting nothing, carrying only the weight of failure and grief. Instead, he had found purpose in the most unlikely place, responsibility in caring for a dying animal, redemption in healing wounded land. The ranch would never make him rich. The work would be hard, the winters brutal, the isolation profound. But he had learned that wealth came in forms that could not be measured in currency, that connection mattered more than comfort, that sometimes salvation arrived in the shape of a sick horse with knowing eyes. As sleep pulled him under, Thomas heard Ember shift in her stall, heard the soft sound of her breathing. Tomorrow he would continue the work of restoration, rebuilding what had been broken, tending what had been neglected. He would learn the rhythms of this land, honor its history, protect its secrets. And he would do it not alone but alongside a creature who had chosen him as surely as he had chosen her. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and indifferent, while below them Blackthorn Ranch settled into its first peaceful night in 40 years. The curse was broken. The land was healing. And two broken souls, one human and one horse, had found in each other a reason to believe that broken things could still be made whole. Winter arrived in earnest during the second month after Thomas had restored the spring. Snow fell heavy and silent, blanketing Blackthorn Ranch in white that transformed it into something from a dream. The mountains disappeared behind curtains of falling flakes, and the world contracted to the boundaries of the property, to the warm glow of lantern light in the barn, to the rhythm of daily care that had become Thomas's anchor. Ember thrived in the cold. Her winter coat grew thick and lustrous, and she moved through the snow with a joy that was infectious. Thomas would watch her from the barn door as she raced across the pasture, kicking up powder, her breath streaming behind her like smoke. In those moments, she looked wild and free, untouched by the suffering she had endured. Yet each evening she would return to the barn, to the stall she had claimed as her own, seeking his company as much as shelter. The transformation of the land had not gone unnoticed in Ridgewood. People began appearing at the ranch with increasing frequency, drawn by curiosity or need or something deeper they could not name. Grace came weekly now, sometimes with food, sometimes with tools or supplies, but mostly with her quiet presence that asked nothing and offered everything. They worked side by side repairing buildings, and in the comfortable silences between them, Thomas felt the first stirrings of something he had thought lost forever. Dr. Garrett brought other cases, animals that conventional treatment had failed, asking if Thomas would allow them on the property. A dog with a tumor that should have killed him months ago. A calf born with twisted legs. A barn cat that had stopped eating and was slowly starving. Thomas agreed, and Grace helped him set up a small shelter in one of the outbuildings. The animals drank from Black Creek, grazed on the healing grass, and one by one they improved. Not all survived, but enough did that word spread. Blackthorn Ranch, once a place of death, was becoming known as a place of miracles. Thomas was uncomfortable with the attention and the expectations that came with it. He was not a healer, not a mystic, just a man who had stumbled into caretaking something larger than himself. But he could not turn away those who came seeking help, human or animal. The ranch had been given back its life, and that life was meant to be shared, not hoarded. Margaret Weston visited on a gray afternoon when the snow had paused but the sky promised more. She came bearing a box of old documents and photographs, materials she had gathered about the Ashford family and the history of the land. Thomas invited her into the farmhouse, which he had finally begun to inhabit, cleaning out the dust and ghosts until it felt almost welcoming. They sat at the kitchen table while Margaret spread the contents of the box before them. There were photographs of the Ashfords during their prosperous years, images of abundant harvests and healthy livestock. There were newspaper clippings about Robert Ashford's amateur archaeological interests, his claims to have found significant Native American sites on his property. And there were letters, correspondence between Robert and various academics, growing increasingly frustrated as his discoveries were dismissed or ignored. He became obsessed, Margaret said, tapping one letter with her finger. He believed he had found something that would change how people understood the indigenous peoples of this region. But when he couldn't get anyone to take him seriously, he decided to prove it himself. That's when he started digging in earnest, and that's when everything fell apart. Thomas listened as Margaret laid out the timeline. The Ashfords had disappeared in February, the coldest month of winter. Their bodies were never found, but Margaret had discovered something in the archives that had never made it into the official reports. A surveyor hired by the county to assess the property after the disappearance had noted in his personal journal that the barn showed signs of recent excavation, that something had been filled in and covered over with fresh boards. They found the cave, Thomas said quietly. Just like I did. Margaret met his eyes. And I think they went down. I think whatever Robert had been looking for, he found it, and it destroyed them. She paused. The question is, what did you find when you went down? Thomas considered lying, protecting the secret as his uncle had. But Margaret had spent years searching for truth, and she had come to him in trust. He told her about the spring, about the iron rod driven through it, about the black water and the healing that had followed its removal. He did not mention the pictographs or the offerings. Some things remained too sacred to speak of casually, but he told her enough. When he finished, Margaret sat back, her expression thoughtful. The Blackfoot stories speak of places where the earth bleeds power, she said. Places that must be tended with respect or they turn poisonous. Robert Ashford found one of those places and treated it like a resource to be exploited. The land defended itself the only way it knew how. And my uncle? Thomas asked. Why did he stay? Margaret smiled sadly. Penance, perhaps. Or duty. Your uncle understood what Robert had done, even if he didn't have all the details. He spent his life making sure no one else made the same mistake. She gathered the documents and photographs, replacing them carefully in the box. Now that responsibility falls to you. The land is healing, but it will need protection. There will always be people like Vincent Mercer who see only profit, who would disturb the spring again if they knew it existed. Thomas nodded slowly, feeling the weight of inheritance settle more firmly on his shoulders. It was not just property he had been given, but guardianship. The thought should have been overwhelming, but instead, it brought clarity. He finally understood why he had stopped on that first morning, why he had chosen to save a dying horse when every practical instinct told him to drive away. He had been called to this place, not by any supernatural force, but by the simple human need to matter, to be responsible for something beyond himself. As winter deepened, Thomas fell into rhythms that felt ancient and right. He rose before dawn to break ice in the water troughs, to feed Ember and the other animals that had taken refuge on the property. He spent his days cutting firewood, maintaining equipment, and learning the 1,000 small skills required to keep a ranch functioning. Grace taught him how to read weather in the mountains, how to recognize when a storm was coming hours before it arrived. Dr. Garrett showed him basic veterinary care, how to treat minor injuries and recognize serious illness. The evenings were Thomas's favorite time. He would sit in the barn with Ember, sometimes reading aloud from his uncle's journals, sometimes simply sharing the silence. The mare had become more than a companion. She was a living reminder of what he had accomplished, of the choice to help rather than abandon, to stay rather than flee. Her presence grounded him in ways he struggled to articulate. One night, as a blizzard howled outside and the barn creaked under the assault of wind, Thomas spoke aloud thoughts he had been turning over for weeks. "I was nothing before I came here," he said to Ember, who stood drowsing in her stall. "I had lost my job, my marriage, my sense of who I was. I thought inheriting this place was just bad luck, one more thing taken from me. But you were here waiting, and you needed me, and that need gave me a reason to keep going when I had none left." Ember opened her eyes and regarded him steadily. In the lamplight, her gaze held that same knowing quality it had possessed from the beginning, as if she understood not just his words but the pain beneath them. "I think you saved me more than I saved you," Thomas continued, his voice rough with emotion. "You gave me purpose. You taught me that broken things can heal if someone cares enough to help them." He reached through the stall bars and she moved close, pressing her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her neck, breathing in the warm smell of horse and hay. "Thank you," he whispered, "for waiting, for trusting me, for being exactly what I needed." Spring arrived like a promise kept. The snow melted in rushing torrents, feeding Black Creek until it sang over its banks. The fields exploded with wildflowers, carpets of blue and yellow and purple that stretched toward the mountains. Thomas planted his first crop, winter wheat that pushed up through the soil in defiant green rows. He had no illusions about becoming wealthy from farming, but the act of planting felt important, a statement that he intended to stay to build something lasting. Grace was there the day he finished seeding the north field. She had brought lunch, sandwiches, and fresh lemonade, and they sat on the tailgate of his truck watching Ember graze among the wildflowers. The mare had put on weight over the winter, her frame filling out until she looked not just healthy but magnificent. "She's ready," Grace said suddenly. "Ready for what?" Thomas asked. "To be ridden." Grace turned to look at him. "You've healed her body, earned her trust. But she's a horse, Thomas. She needs to work, to have purpose beyond just existing. Riding her would complete the healing, for both of you." Thomas had not considered it. The thought of riding Ember felt presumptuous somehow, as if he would be taking advantage of the bond between them. But Grace's words made sense. Horses were not meant to be ornaments or pets. They were partners, working animals that thrived when given meaningful tasks. Over the next weeks, Grace helped him reintroduce Ember to saddle and bridle. The mare accepted both with surprising ease, as if remembering training from long ago. The first time Thomas mounted her, his heart hammered with a mixture of excitement and terror. Ember stood rock-steady beneath him, waiting. When he gave the gentlest pressure with his legs, she moved forward smoothly, her gait even and controlled. They rode the property together that spring, man and horse moving as one across land that bloomed with new life. Thomas learned every corner of Blackthorn Ranch from horseback, every hidden valley and rocky outcrop, every stand of trees and stretch of meadow. The land revealed itself to him in ways it never had on foot, its beauty and complexity overwhelming. And Ember seemed to take joy in showing it to him, her ears pricked forward, her step light and eager. One afternoon, they rode to the ridge that overlooked the entire valley. From that vantage point, Thomas could see Ridgewood nestled among the foothills, could trace the silver thread of Black Creek through the landscape, could mark the boundaries of his property and beyond. The view was breathtaking, and for the first time since arriving in Montana, Thomas felt something close to happiness. He had come here with nothing, had found a dying horse and a cursed property, and had somehow transformed both through simple persistence and care. The ranch would never be easy. The work would remain hard, the isolation challenging, the winters brutal. But he had discovered something about himself that he had not known. He was capable of more than he had believed, strong enough to face darkness and emerge intact, brave enough to commit to something larger than his own comfort. Vincent Mercer made one final attempt to acquire the property in late spring. He arrived with lawyers and paperwork, with offers that had increased to absurd levels, with barely veiled threats about eminent domain and development rights. Thomas listened politely to everything they had to say, and when they finished, he walked them to the ridge where he had sat with Ember. "Look at this valley," Thomas said, gesturing to the landscape spread before them. "This is what you want to pave over to subdivide and sell. These mountains, this creek, this land that has been sacred for longer than our country has existed. You see profit margins and return on investment. I see responsibility." Mercer's expression hardened. "You're a fool. You could be wealthy." "I am wealthy," Thomas replied quietly. "I have clean water and healthy land. I have a horse that trusts me and neighbors who respect me. I have purpose and peace. What you're offering can't compete with that." The lawyers left, their expensive cars struggling on the rough driveway, and Thomas knew they would not return. Mercer would find other places to develop, other valleys to transform. Blackthorn Ranch was safe, at least for now, protected by the stubbornness of one man who had learned that some things were worth more than money. Summer brought visitors from across the state, people who had heard stories about the healing ranch and wanted to see it for themselves. Thomas welcomed them cautiously, allowing them to walk the property, to drink from the creek, to sit in the meadows among the wildflowers. He did not charge for access, did not try to profit from what the land offered freely. Some left donations anyway, tucking bills into his mailbox or leaving supplies on his porch, and he accepted these gifts with gratitude, using them to care for the animals that continued to arrive. Dr. Garrett began bringing veterinary students, using the ranch as a teaching opportunity. Grace started a small herb garden near the house, planting medicinal plants that thrived in the restored soil. Margaret documented everything, creating an archive of the ranch's transformation that she promised would be preserved for future generations. Sheriff Hutchins stopped by regularly, ostensibly on patrol but really just to check in, to share coffee and conversation. Thomas found himself at the center of a community he had not sought but could not imagine living without. These people had accepted him, had embraced his mission, had become the family he thought he had lost. And at the heart of it all was Ember, the horse who had started everything, who had refused to die even when death would have been easier, who had waited in the darkness for someone to care enough to find her. On a warm evening in August, as the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Thomas stood at the fence watching Ember roll in the dust of the pasture. She looked absurd and joyful, her legs kicking at the air, her eyes closed in bliss. When she finally stood and shook herself, sending up clouds of dust that caught the light, she looked directly at him, and Thomas would swear for the rest of his life that she was smiling. He thought about the man he had been when he arrived, hollow and defeated, carrying grief like a stone. That man felt like a stranger now, someone he had been required to be but was no longer. The losses that had defined him had not disappeared. His marriage was still over, his career still ended, the future still uncertain. But those things no longer owned him. He had built something new from the ruins of what had been, had found redemption not through forgetting the past but through choosing a different future. Ember trotted over to the fence and thrust her head over the rail, demanding attention. Thomas obliged, scratching her favorite spot behind her ears, while she leaned into his touch with exaggerated pleasure. In the fading light, her coat seemed to glow with an inner fire, living up to the name he had given her months ago when she had been more dead than alive. "We made it," Thomas said softly. "Both of us. We made it through." The mare snorted, her warm breath against his face, and in that simple exchange Thomas felt a completeness he had not known was possible. He had come to Montana to escape, to hide from the wreckage of his former life. Instead, he had found a reason to rebuild. The cursed ranch had become a sanctuary. The dying horse had become a partner and friend. And the broken man had become someone who mattered, not because of what he had accomplished in the world, but because he had chosen compassion over convenience, persistence over despair. As darkness settled over Blackthorn Ranch and the first stars appeared above the mountains, Thomas walked back to the barn with Ember following at his shoulder. Inside, he lit the lanterns and prepared her evening feed while she watched with patient interest. The barn smelled of clean hay and healthy horse, of wood and leather and the lingering sweetness of summer grass. Smelled like home. Thomas leaned against the stall door, watching Ember eat, and felt gratitude so profound it ached in his chest. He had been given a second chance, an opportunity to prove that he was more than his failures, and he had seized it with both hands. The ancient secret beneath the barn remained hidden, protected, the spring flowing pure and strong in the darkness below. The land was healing, spreading that healing to everything it touched. And he, Thomas Brennan, former construction worker, divorced and unemployed, had become the guardian of something precious and irreplaceable. The future stretched before him, uncertain but no longer frightening. There would be hard winters and failed crops. There would be animals he could not save and challenges he could not overcome. But he would face them all with Ember beside him, with the community that had formed around him, with the knowledge that he belonged somewhere at last. He had found his place in the world, and it was here, on this ranch at the edge of wilderness, tending land that had chosen him as surely as he had chosen it. As he settled into his bed in the barn, listening to Ember's steady breathing in the next stall, Thomas felt peace settle over him like a blanket. Tomorrow he would rise early and begin again, would feed and water and repair, would protect and nurture and grow. It was simple work, unglamorous and unnoticed by most of the world. But it was his work, his purpose, his redemption. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Autumn returned to Blackthorn Ranch with a painter's palette of gold and crimson, the aspens along Black Creek blazing against the evergreen backdrop of the mountains. Thomas stood on the porch of the farmhouse he had finally made his own, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching the first light touch the peaks. A year had passed since he had pulled the iron rod from the sacred spring, and the transformation of the land continued to unfold in ways that surprised him daily. The harvest had been modest but honest. The winter wheat he had planted in spring had yielded enough to sell at the co-op in Ridgewood, providing income that, while not substantial, proved the land could support him. More importantly, it proved the curse was truly broken. Crops grew where they had withered for decades. The soil was rich and dark, teeming with earthworms and beneficial insects that had been absent for generations. Thomas had hired help during harvest, young men from town who had heard the stories and wanted to be part of something that felt like renewal. Ember grazed in the pasture below, her coat thick in preparation for the coming winter. She had become something of a local legend, the horse that should not exist, whose recovery had sparked the healing of the entire valley. People came from across Montana just to see her, and Thomas had grown accustomed to finding visitors at his fence, cameras in hand, hoping for a glimpse. He did not mind. Ember seemed to enjoy the attention, would often approach the fence and pose as if she understood her role in the story people told about this place. But there was more to tell now, developments that Thomas had not anticipated when he first chose to stay. The ranch had become a refuge not just for sick animals but for people seeking something they could not name. Grace had formalized the arrangement, creating a small nonprofit that allowed them to accept donations and provide structured care for animals that needed the specific healing the land offered. They had expanded the facilities, building proper kennels and paddocks, installing medical equipment donated by Dr. Garrett's network of veterinary colleagues. Thomas found himself managing a staff of 3, including a young woman named Rachel who had come as a volunteer and stayed because, as she put it, the ranch made her feel like she was doing something that mattered. She was good with the animals, patient and intuitive, and she had a particular bond with Ember, spending hours grooming the mare and riding her along the creek trails. Thomas recognized in Rachel the same hunger for purpose that had driven him, and he gave her increasing responsibility, teaching her what he had learned about the land and its needs. The farmhouse had been transformed as well. Grace had helped him clear out the last of his uncle's belongings, boxing up the journals and personal effects with respect but also with the understanding that the house needed to serve the living, not memorialize the dead. They had painted walls, refinished floors, and opened curtains that had been drawn for 40 years. Light poured into rooms that had known only shadow, and with the light came warmth and the possibility of connection. It was Grace who had pushed him to host the gathering. A year anniversary, she called it, though what they were celebrating was harder to define. The healing of the land, certainly. The survival of Ember. But also something more personal, the rebuilding of a man who had arrived broken and was learning to be whole. Thomas had resisted at first, uncomfortable with being the center of attention, But Grace had insisted, and when Grace insisted, resistance was generally futile. So on a Saturday in late September, as the sun climbed toward noon, trucks and cars began arriving at Blackthorn Ranch. Dr. Garrett came with his wife, a quiet woman who taught at the elementary school in Ridgewood. Margaret brought boxes of photographs documenting the transformation, images she planned to archive at the library. Sheriff Hutchins arrived with his deputies, off-duty but in uniform anyway, bringing coolers of drinks and folding chairs. Neighbors Thomas had met over the past year came with covered dishes, their children running wild across the pasture while Ember watched from a respectful distance. Rachel had set up tables near the barn, decorating them with wildflowers picked from the meadows. The food accumulated until the tables groaned under the weight of casseroles and pies, roasted vegetables and grilled meats. It was more food than they could possibly eat, but that was the point, Thomas realized. This was not just about feeding bodies but about creating abundance where scarcity had ruled, about celebrating plenty after years of want. Grace found him standing slightly apart from the crowd, observing rather than participating, and linked her arm through his. "You need to mingle," she said firmly. "These people came to see you, to celebrate what you've accomplished." "I didn't accomplish anything," Thomas protested. "I just removed something that shouldn't have been there." Grace turned to face him, her expression serious. "You did more than that, and you know it. You chose to stay when everyone expected you to leave. You fought for a horse that anyone else would have given up on. You protected sacred ground from men who would have destroyed it for profit. And you opened this place to anyone who needed healing, human or animal, without asking for anything in return." She squeezed his arm. "That's not nothing, Thomas. That's everything." Before he could respond, Margaret called for everyone's attention. The crowd gathered near the tables, conversations fading into expectant silence. Margaret stood on a chair, her gray hair catching the sunlight, her face animated with excitement. "Most of you know the story of Blackthorn Ranch," she began. "How it was cursed for decades, how animals died and crops failed, how people vanished or went mad trying to live here." She gestured toward Thomas. "This man inherited that curse, and instead of running from it, he faced it. He discovered what his Uncle Silas had known but couldn't fix, and he did what needed to be done." She paused, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "But what you might not know is what the land has given back." Margaret pulled out a document, unfolding it carefully. "I've been researching water quality in this valley for the past 6 months, working with the state environmental agency. Black Creek, which runs through Blackthorn Ranch, now has the purest water of any stream in Montana. Not just clean, but pure in ways that are almost unprecedented. Fish populations have exploded. Plant species that were thought extinct in this region have reappeared along its banks. And every property downstream has reported improvements in their own soil quality, their own yields." The crowd murmured, heads turning to look at Thomas. He felt heat rise in his face, uncomfortable with the implication that he was responsible for something so far-reaching. "The land was always good," Thomas said quietly, but loud enough to be heard. "It was just wounded. All I did was help it heal." "That's exactly right," Margaret agreed. "And in doing so, you've helped all of us heal. This valley was dying, slowly but surely. Now it's coming back to life, and Blackthorn Ranch is the heart of that resurrection." Dr. Garrett stepped forward then, his weathered face creased in a smile. "I want to add something, if I may." He looked at Thomas. "When I first came here and examined that mare, I told you she was dying and there was nothing I could do to save her. I was wrong. Not about her condition, that was as bad as I thought, but about the possibility of recovery. You proved that with enough care, enough dedication, even the most hopeless cases can turn around." He gestured toward the paddocks where several animals grazed. "Every creature we've brought here since has benefited from what you learned with Ember. You've created something unprecedented, a place where healing happens not despite the land but because of it." The crowd broke into applause, and Thomas felt Grace's hand slip into his, her fingers warm and steady. He looked out at the gathered faces, at the people who had become his community without him quite realizing when it had happened. They were not just celebrating the ranch or even Ember. They were celebrating the idea that broken things could be mended, that curses could be lifted, that hope could take root in the most unlikely soil. As the afternoon wore on, the gathering took on the character of a festival. Children organized races across the pasture, their laughter carrying on the wind. Adults shared stories and traded gossip, the conversation flowing as freely as the drinks from the coolers. Rachel led groups on tours of the facilities, explaining the work they did and the animals currently in residence. Ember, sensing the festive atmosphere, performed for her admirers, trotting along the fence line with her tail high, accepting apple slices and carrots from anyone who offered. Thomas found himself drawn into conversation after conversation, listening to stories from people whose lives had been touched by the ranch in ways he had not known. A woman whose dog had recovered from what 3 veterinarians had said was untreatable cancer. A man whose depression had lifted after spending a month volunteering in the stables. A teenage girl who had found direction after weeks of riding Ember along the mountain trails. The weight of their gratitude was almost overwhelming, but beneath the discomfort, Thomas felt something else. A sense of rightness, of having found the place where his particular gifts, small though they seemed, made a measurable difference. As evening approached and the guests began to depart, thanking Thomas with handshakes and hugs, Grace remained behind to help clean up. They worked in comfortable silence, gathering plates and folding chairs, while Rachel herded the last of the visitors toward their vehicles. When the final truck disappeared down the driveway, Thomas stood with Grace watching the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, "for all of this, for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." Grace looked at him, her expression soft in the fading light. "You did the work, Thomas. I just reminded you that you were capable of it." She paused, then continued. "Your Uncle Silas, he knew this place needed someone like you. Someone who understood brokenness but hadn't given up on healing. That's why he left it to you, even though you barely knew him. He recognized something in you that you hadn't seen yet in yourself." Thomas thought about the uncle he had never really known. The strange old man who had lived alone on cursed land for 40 years, protecting a secret he could not share. In a way, Silas had been the first guardian, had sacrificed his own happiness to ensure no one else disturbed what lay beneath the barn. Now that responsibility had passed to Thomas, but with it came something Silas had never allowed himself. Community, connection, the support of people who understood what he was protecting and why it mattered. The stars emerged one by one, sharp and bright in the clear mountain air. Thomas walked Grace to her truck, standing in the driveway as she climbed in and started the engine. She rolled down the window, leaning out to look at him. "You know this isn't really the end," she said. "It's just the beginning. This place, what you're building here, it's going to grow. More animals will come, more people. You'll need to expand, to formalize things even more. Are you ready for that?" Thomas considered the question honestly. A year ago, he would have said no, would have retreated from the responsibility and the exposure that came with it. But he was not the same man who had arrived here desperate and hollow. The work had changed him, or perhaps revealed who he had always been beneath the layers of defeat and disappointment. "I think so," he said finally. "As long as Ember stays healthy and the land stays pure, I can handle whatever comes." Grace smiled. "Good, because I have plans for this place, and they involve you whether you like it or not." She put the truck in gear, then paused. "One more thing. Your uncle kept journals, but he also kept maps. Very detailed maps of the cave system beneath the ranch. Margaret has them at the library. You should look at them, understand the full extent of what you're protecting." Thomas nodded, a chill running down his spine despite the warm evening. He had been back to the spring only once since restoring it, had descended the narrow passage to ensure the water ran clear and the cairn remained undisturbed. The pictographs on the walls haunted his dreams sometimes, images of ceremonies and beings that existed in the spaces between the human and the divine. He knew there was more to discover in those caves, more secrets waiting in the darkness, but he had not felt ready to explore them. Maybe now was the time. Maybe understanding the full scope of what lay beneath his land was the next step in becoming its true guardian. He watched Grace's taillights disappear into the gathering dark, then turned back toward the barn where a single lantern glowed in the window. Ember was waiting in her stall, had been given her evening grain by Rachel before the young woman left, but she nickered softly when Thomas entered. He went to her, wrapping his arms around her neck, breathing in the familiar smell of horse and hay. She leaned into him, her warmth solid and reassuring. "We've come a long way," Thomas murmured into her mane. "Both of us. But I think there's further to go." Over the following weeks, Thomas made time to visit the library and study the maps Grace had mentioned. Margaret spread them across a large table in the back room, pages yellowed with age, covered in Silas's meticulous handwriting. The cave system was far more extensive than Thomas had imagined, tunnels branching in multiple directions from the main chamber where the spring emerged. Silas had marked certain passages as dangerous, others as sacred, and still others simply as unexplored. One tunnel in particular caught Thomas's attention. It led north from the spring chamber, deeper into the mountain, and beside it Silas had written a single word: origin. Thomas traced the line with his finger, following it to where it disappeared off the edge of the map. Whatever lay at the end of that passage, his uncle had either never reached it or had chosen not to document it. Margaret stood beside him, her arms crossed, studying the maps with the intensity of someone piecing together a puzzle. "Your uncle was thorough," she said. "Every symbol, every notation, it all means something. This is more than just a map. It's a record of his understanding of the sacred geography beneath your land." "Should I explore it?" Thomas asked. "The rest of the system, I mean. Try to find what he didn't document." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "That depends," she said finally. "Are you doing it to satisfy curiosity, or because you believe it's necessary to protect what you've been given? There's a difference, and the motivation matters." Thomas thought about the question about why the unmarked tunnel called to him. It was not mere curiosity, though that was part of it. It was the sense that his guardianship was incomplete, that he could not truly protect what he did not fully understand. The spring was healed, the land restored, but the origin of that power remained mysterious. If he was going to ensure nothing like the Ashford tragedy happened again, he needed to know what he was truly dealing with. "I need to understand it completely," Thomas said. "Not to exploit it or change it, but to protect it properly." Margaret nodded slowly. "Then go. But take precautions. Tell Grace and me before you descend. Bring proper equipment. And Thomas," her voice became stern, "if you find something that feels wrong, that makes you uncomfortable, come back immediately. Some knowledge is dangerous, and some places are meant to remain undisturbed." Thomas returned to the ranch with the maps, spreading them in his room and studying them late into the night. He planned his exploration carefully, purchasing climbing rope and proper lighting, a first aid kit and emergency provisions. He told Grace and Rachel what he intended, saw the worry in their eyes but also their understanding. They knew, as he did, that this was necessary. On a crisp morning in late October, with fresh snow dusting the peaks and the air sharp as broken glass, Thomas descended into the caves. He moved through the now familiar passage to the spring chamber, pausing to check that the water ran pure and clear. The cairn stood undisturbed, the offerings still in place, the pictographs vivid on the walls. He lit a lantern and consulted the map, then turned north, toward the passage Silas had marked origin. The tunnel was narrow at first, forcing him to move sideways, his shoulders scraping stone worn smooth by water and time. The air grew colder as he descended, his breath misting in the lantern light. The walls here bore different pictographs, older and more abstract, spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Thomas moved slowly, respectfully, aware that he was trespassing on ground that had been sacred for longer than he could comprehend. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes according to his watch, the passage opened into a chamber that took his breath away. It was smaller than the spring room but infinitely more complex. The walls were covered in crystal formations that caught his lantern light and threw it back in 1,000 colors. In the center of the chamber, a pool of water sat absolutely still, its surface like black glass. And above the pool, suspended somehow in the stone itself, was a vein of some mineral that glowed with a soft blue light, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. Thomas approached the pool slowly, every instinct telling him he was in the presence of something profound. The water was perfectly clear, and when he knelt beside it and looked down, he saw not stone beneath but depth that seemed to go on forever, as if the pool was a window into some vast underground sea. The blue vein above pulsed in rhythm with his own heartbeat, and he realized with a start that it was responding to his presence, acknowledging him. This was it, the origin. Not the source of the water that came from rainfall and snowmelt filtering through the mountain, but the source of the power. This chamber, this pool, this glowing mineral, they formed some kind of convergence point, a place where earth energy concentrated and radiated outward through the spring, through the creek, through the land itself. The Blackfoot had known about this place, had understood its importance, and had protected it through ceremony and respect. Robert Ashford had found it and tried to harness it, driving the iron rod through the spring to redirect its power. Instead, he had ruptured the flow, poisoning everything the water touched. Thomas sat beside the pool for a long time, watching the blue light pulse, feeling the rightness of this place settle into his bones. He understood now why his uncle had sealed the entrance, why the maps had been hidden, why this secret had to be protected. This was not just a sacred site in the cultural or historical sense. It was a living thing, a beating heart beneath the mountain, and its health was tied to the health of everything above it. To disturb this place, to try to exploit or alter it, would be catastrophic not just for Blackthorn Ranch but for the entire valley. When Thomas finally emerged back into daylight, blinking in the afternoon sun, he felt changed in ways he could not yet articulate. He had gone into the caves seeking understanding and had found something larger, a responsibility that went beyond simple guardianship. He was not just protecting sacred ground from development or desecration. He was protecting a living system, an ancient power that sustained the land and everything that depended on it. Grace was waiting at the barn when he returned, her face tight with worry that dissolved into relief when she saw him. She hugged him tightly, then stepped back, studying his face. "You found it," she said. "It wasn't a question." Thomas nodded. "I understand now. All of it. Why my uncle stayed, why the land died when the spring was wounded, why it matters so much that this place is protected." He looked toward the mountains, their peaks glowing in the late light. "This isn't just a ranch, Grace. It's a sanctuary in the truest sense. And I'm not just its owner. I'm its keeper." Grace smiled, her eyes bright. "Then keep it well, Thomas Brennan. Keep it well." As winter settled over Blackthorn Ranch once more, Thomas fell into a deeper rhythm with the land. He understood it now in ways he had not before, could feel its moods and needs almost intuitively. He worked with the seasons, never against them, learned to read the subtle signs that told him when to plant and when to rest, when to open the land to visitors and when to give it privacy. Ember remained his constant companion, the living symbol of everything the ranch represented. Together they rode the boundaries of the property, Thomas checking fences and water sources, Ember simply reveling in the movement and the partnership. On clear nights, they would stand together at the ridge overlooking the valley, and Thomas would tell her about the chamber beneath the mountain, about the glowing blue vein and the pool that held depths beyond measuring. He did not know if she understood his words, but he believed she understood their meaning. They were guardians together, protectors of something precious and irreplaceable. The ranch prospered in ways that had nothing to do with money. More animals came and were healed. More people found solace in the work of caring for creatures that needed them. The nonprofit Grace had established grew, attracting volunteers from across the state and donations that allowed them to expand their facilities and their mission. Thomas remained at the center of it all, the quiet presence that held everything together, the man who had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. And in the darkness beneath the barn, the spring flowed pure and strong, feeding the creek that nourished the valley, its water carrying healing in every drop. The blue vein pulsed in its hidden chamber, a heartbeat that sustained the land and all who depended on it. The curse was broken, the secret protected, and Blackthorn Ranch had become what it was always meant to be. Not a place of fear and death, but a place of hope and renewal, where broken things found healing and lost souls found home. Thomas Brennan had come to Montana with nothing, seeking only a place to disappear. Instead, he had found a dying horse and a wounded land, and in saving them had saved himself. The legacy he was building would outlast him, would continue long after he was gone, a testament to the truth that compassion could heal even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the greatest treasures were not found but chosen, not given but earned through the simple act of refusing to give up. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.